a busy place.
Kind of good, but
yeah, very wonderful place.
Wonderful place. Yeah, really, really great vets. It was awesome.
Yeah,
fantastic. So just before we start, I'll just do a little bit on the techie stuff. As usual, guys, if you could, you should be able to see a Q&A box. If you want to ask questions, if you could use the Q&A rather than the chat, that's really helpful just for Thea and I to try and organise those questions. And feel free to type them as you go. So if there's something that comes up and you think, oh, I want to ask a question about that, type it in, and then we'll either ask it when it seems like an appropriate place, or we'll save some of those questions as well for the end. So, but just feel free to type away as you wish. And as normal, if you've got one screen, you'll probably see a little grey line between the slides and the pictures of the people, and you can move that little grey line left or right to make the slides bigger or the person bigger. So I think those are the key things. We're recording like always, so that should be available within the next 48 hours to watch back and to revise from. And at the end of today's webinar, there'll be a very brief questionnaire just to ask you how you found today and what ideas you've got for the future. And I think that's the basics.
Well, all we need to do now is give a very, very warm welcome to Lucy. So thank you for joining us from very near to Newmarket, that famous horse town. And as Lucy said, she spent 15 years working as an equine vet. So Lucy has a lot of knowledge that she's going to share with us tonight. So do remember to ask lots of questions that are relevant for you and your horse or horses. In 2012, so 11 years ago now, you became a member of the BEVA, didn't you? The British Equine Veterinary Association Council, and you chaired the Ethics and Welfare Committee and sat on the Equestrian Sports Committee. So you've been involved in BEVA for a long time. And we are very delighted that we have a former president as well of BEVA with us. So in 2020, Lucy was elected as president of BEVA, and fairly recently, last August, moved into a permanent role for them as Veterinary Projects Officer. So you've got lots of interests, including vetting's lameness, poor performance, but you have this massively overarching passion for horse welfare, which is one of the reasons you're sharing your thoughts, knowledge and understanding of this topic tonight, which is, as we were saying just at the beginning, very, very good timing with the spring grass absolutely rocketing at the moment. So without further ado, Lucy, we'll hand over to you, and then we'll come back and support when we've got some questions to put to you.
Okay. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you both, and thanks for having me. So yeah, I mean, it's great to see this topic getting so much airtime, because I think probably 5 years ago, certainly when I joined council back in 2012, there was a huge lack of understanding about horse weight, horse obesity, what it meant, the detrimental effects of it. And I'd say definitely in the last sort of 5 to 6 years, we've seen a huge surge in awareness. And that's come from a lot of work from the charities, it's come from BEVA, it's come from horse owners, BHS, everybody's suddenly waking up and realizing what a big problem equine weight is. And I'm going to talk you through not just the obvious stuff that we all know and we all hear all the time about horse weight, laminitis, but actually talk about the subject a little bit more widely to try and inspire, I suppose, a bit more thought about why it's such a problem, why we struggle, and also try and sympathise with those that are probably some of you guys in the audience that battle with it every day and are desperately trying to help their horses. But it is not an easy battle to win, and that's why we're going to talk about it in the way we are tonight. So to start off with, I think it's probably everyone, I'm sure, knows about body condition scoring. And when we talk about condition, and we have to think a bit carefully about what terminology we use, we've learned that through quite a lot of studies that have been done in the equestrian sort of industry on this subject, that when we talk about condition, it can bring up good and bad, but we use it as an overarching term for when we're looking at whether the horse is underweight, correct weight, or overweight. And that could be to do with fat or muscle, could be to do with breed, bone, you know, all sorts of things will contribute to weight. So that's why we don't just talk about weight. And we know this from humans as well, you'll all be aware. Some people talk about fat scoring, which is another way to look at how a horse's condition is made up. But by and large, body condition scoring is what we all have come to know. There's lots of different systems. So there's 0 to 5 system, 1 to 9 system. They're simply saying, is it thin? Is it fat? Is it underweight? Is it overweight? But actually, I bet all of you know this already. It is way more complicated than even those things. And we can try and simplify it so we can grasp the subject. But actually, in order for it to be understood how it's working and be able to know whether what we're doing is working, sometimes you have to invest a little bit more in the time you take in understanding what your horse's body condition is. Now, I think despite all the leaflets that have been released over probably 15 plus years, let's face it, from different charities and people, the best leaflet, actually, the best description and the best diagrams I've ever seen are actually this one that's hidden away in a research paper that came out of an American vet school. And I just think the diagram here that you see, and you can find this online and we can provide links for it afterwards, this is given, I think, the most realistic impression of a horse's body condition. If you look at some of the other diagrams of the body condition scoring charts, they look a little bit cartoony, they look a bit extreme. You know, the 0 is completely skeletal and probably would have died if it had been that weight in real life. And then the 5 looks like this really sort of disproportionate, ridiculous kind of obese animal that you'd probably only seen as a cartoon sketch. So I think some of those don't help us understand body condition scoring, because you just automatically rule those two out and you start looking at the horse in a much more shortened scale way. Whereas this description, I think, with those images is quite a good way of seeing how easily you could get into the wrong extremes of your body condition scores without perhaps quite realizing it. So that was the first bit I want to talk about. Then, where, as I mentioned before, the weight in kilos is really valuable. I'm not dismissing weight in kilos as being valuable, and it's very good for tracking changes in weight. But again, when you look at weight in kilos, that's just overall body condition. That's all the different tissues. When you're talking about obesity, we're really, really concerned with those fat pads. And so there's been other systems that have been introduced, and I'm not going to go through them all in detail here. That's like a whole nother talk in itself. But the other way would be to measure the classical areas where the fat pads tend to sit. So there has been descriptions of how you can measure the neck circumference. So classically, you're going for that widest part of the neck where the crest fat sits, the girth circumference, which is right where the girth sits. So trying to get that kind of fatty shoulder pad that you get on the horses, plus that kind of abdominal fat and the fat that kind of sits beneath them where the girth is. Then you're also getting belly fat, which is really the rib cage and the back fat. And then you get this rump width or rump measurements, where you're trying to take into account that kind of apple bottom shape, that peachy rump and tailhead fat. So there's lots of ways to do it. Now, none of them are right or wrong. They're actually all measuring different things if you think about it. But what we need to determine with individuals is what's going to be most useful for them. So let's just quickly touch on underweight, because I think it's important, whilst we go on about overweight, we shouldn't ignore underweight as being an issue either. It's possibly less common, I'd say, in this country particularly. You'll all be familiar with things like the adverts for the Brook charity, and you know, in third world countries, developing countries, obviously an underweight horse is much more common an issue. In the UK, it's definitely less common. So it's more a result in this country of true neglect, so true rescue cases that have been, you know, locked up away from food and been unable to food. In a more kind of typical owner environment, the underweight horses are often the older ones that have normally lost teeth or have dental pain and aren't chewing their food properly. So not just eating the food, but they're not chewing it properly and getting the nutrition out of it in the gut. You can get underweight horses from worm burdens, but that's actually much less common nowadays. And also you tend to not get such a severe weight loss until it's really, really end stage and really been neglected for some time. There are types of infection, particularly chronic infections and chronic diseases, that will end up with a very poor weight and poor body condition. The other one I would say that can be much more overlooked on average and can be dismissed, I think, more easily by people accidentally, is that the horse can be in pain. So chronic low-grade pain can result in poor weight sustainment, so poor weight gain, poor weight maintenance in horses. So that shouldn't be underlooked either. And I think most of these things are normally stemming from a lack of understanding and lack of knowledge. So hopefully if people go and ask for the right advice, if their horse is underweight, they should be able to get to the bottom of why that is much more easily. When we talk about horses being overweight, it becomes a slightly more difficult subject area, actually, because being overweight, you'd have to ask yourself, is that actually a form of neglect? Now, all of you out there who might have horses that are overweight, please don't panic. Think that you're going to get an RSPCA inspector knocking at your door. I think, you know, on the whole, when we're talking about overweight horses and neglect, it's very rare that truly overweight, neglected horses are ever picked up on and considered welfare cases, rightly or wrongly, possibly because people don't consider an overweight horse to be in danger like they would an underweight horse. However, we have had cases in recent years where there have been prosecutions via the RSPCA for horses that have been neglected in an overweight state. So they've been left, basically with too much access to grass or fed too much hay, whatever it is, under-exercised, not cared for. And their overweightness has resulted in them being considered a neglect case or a mistreatment case. The other causes of overweight body condition can come under the same categories that we've already discussed. So there are diseases which will cause your horse to be overweight. They're not in the sort of true sense a disease as in something that causes it to get fat. But what it can do is have something like EMS, so equine metabolic syndrome, which you probably all heard of, is a condition in the horse's metabolism, which ultimately is possibly genetically derived, so it comes from its body makeup, if you like, and its genes, that means it is very liable to get overweight. It won't cause it to be fat because it still needs to get that energy to create the fat pads from somewhere. But it will mean that being fed on potentially a very normal or even a very low calorie diet, it's still going to be quite heavy, quite overweight, quite fat. So there are disease patterns where we see horses that are going to have an increased tendency to carry fat and maintain fat despite people's best efforts. And that's really important to remember. So we'll talk about that a bit later. The genetics, as I've just mentioned, do extend, we think, at least beyond just those of the metabolics of the horse. So genetics such as breed, and not just breed, because breed's a really obvious one that we're all very aware of, but actually even in bloodlines, so within a breed. So you might see certain bloodlines are much more likely to be overweight and struggle to reduce weight and lose weight than other bloodlines within that same breed. And then we've obviously got the classical thing, which is what we need to really concentrate on ultimately, because that's the bit we can really control as much as possible, is the management. And that includes the diet and the exercise. And again, I think most of the overweight cases that we see are not true neglect. I don't think they're malice. I think it's a lack of understanding. It's a lack of understanding how dangerous it is for a horse to be overweight, and also how we can affect it, how we can change that. Now, when we're talking about the problems, so why is it important to worry about your horse's weight? Well, obviously, if a horse is underweight, I think we'd all agree that it is an issue. We do need to worry about it. Not only is it going to probably get the attention of others and have you being criticised as an owner, but it will cause the horse issues in terms of weakness and being prone to injury. And we know that horses that are struggling with poor condition will also have the same issues within their body system. So they'll have a reduced immunity, they'll be prone to other diseases, prone to infection. So, and their coat and their hoof quality, things like that will suffer, which we probably all kind of know and have thought of before. When it comes to being overweight, what are the classic issues? Why is it a problem? Why can we not just leave these horses as they are and just dismiss it as a problem that we can't change? Well, the key one, as you're probably all very aware of, is laminitis. So not that long ago, but long enough ago that we should all know it, it was proven that there was a link. So being obese massively increases your risk of getting laminitis. Not only does it do that, which is obviously the most life-threatening one, but it does increase risk of musculoskeletal injury. So that's injury to the bones, the joints, the tendons, the ligaments. It can cause respiratory issues. It can cause foot problems, foot growth problems. And it has a knock-on effect as an inflammatory problem, as it does in humans, creating a multitude of other body system issues, which are much harder to connect up, but we know are there from other species research. So let's just scale back a bit, because I think it's much easier to look at equine obesity if we consider other species. So I'm just going to take a different tack probably from what you might have seen before. So obesity is a problem in lots of species, as we know. It's an issue worldwide. We know from humans and other species, dogs included, that we have something called a thrifty genotype. So certain individuals in any species will always be more prone to getting overweight. Then we have the issue of an obesogenic environment, and that's a really cool word, a buzzword that's used in this field of research. When you've got an environment that literally creates the perfect setup for you to get overweight, to get obese. So that would be why the UK is so bad for horses, because we have got the grass, we've got potentially money, if you think about it, as a horse owning nation, to feed our animals, rug our animals. You know, the factors that can encourage, if you like, weight gain are just there. They're all around us, much like us in the first world countries, developed countries. You know, we've got supermarkets full of food, sugary drinks, all these other things. And not only that, but we've kind of allowed obesity to sustain itself in our populations of different species, because we've allowed our medical interventions to help us along. So despite being obese and having lots of, as we call it, comorbidities, lots of other diseases that we get as a result, our medical advancement means we cope with it. We live, we survive it, we treat it, we manage it, but we don't stop it. We don't get rid of the obesity. We just carry on being obese, but managing all these other sort of issues that we develop as a result. And unfortunately, it's become modern culture, and there's no getting around that. You know, we've, particularly in the UK and in America and other places where it's very commonly known, you know, being overweight is actually normalized now, quite scarily, and is become, you know, to most onlookers, what a normal person, dog or horse, looks like. So we've got to bear that in mind, that we've got this bias, as they call it, where we think that those animals look okay. So just to scare you with some statistics, because I always find these are quite hard hitting, but really get us in the right frame of mind. You know, across the world, we've got 1.9 billion human adults that are overweight. 650 million of them are obese. That's 13% of the world's population, adult population. Okay, that's a massively shocking statistic if you think about it. And we know from other research that there's a fourfold increase in global child and adolescent obesity between the years of 1975 and 2016. So, you know, obesity has absolutely rocketed in humans and in children in particular. And the children bit is interesting, because when we look at children in particular, they're often not feeding themselves. Child obesity often is a result of parents overfeeding or under exercising, if you want to make it an analogy to horses. And that is much more similar to horse owners and their horses, or even dog owners and dogs. So that's where we draw a lot of conclusions. 41 million children under the age of 5 are overweight or obese. It's pretty shocking. And 4 million people are dying each year as a result of obesity. So it's not like we haven't got this close to home. This is going on within our own population, our own species. So, you know, this is something we should not be surprised at, and we should be prepared for and really looking into. Now, when you look at pets, so there's lots of studies, and this is pets in general. So 22 to 44%, so not far off half really of pets are in the world are considered obese. And I think that's not surprising. Humans love feeding and caring and nurturing. It's kind of in our genes, if you like. So we have to be aware that we're programmed to overfeed our animals. But obesity is also increasing amongst some domestic and wild animals who aren't being overfed or under-exercised. So that, for me, is a really fascinating point that we are revealing more and more with research. So we are seeing obesity for other reasons, okay? And I want you to hold that thought, okay? This isn't a get out of jail free card, but this is just making everyone realise how much more of a challenge it is than simply just sticking on a grazing muzzle and feeding less and just doing riding, okay? It's not always that simple. Now, here we go, come into the horse world. So 70% of equines, this was a UK study, are overweight. Now, that is pretty scary. So why is it so bad in this country? Now, we've already talked about the genetics thing. I think we've got lots of native breeds, basically, cob types, which have all thrived in our country, in our environment, in our social kind of stand, if you like, because they're nice, easy riding horses. They're easy to look after. They don't require too much maintenance. They're good doers. Okay, remember talking about good doers, okay, and how good a thing that was. Then we've got this other really interesting bit that's creeping into the research right now, which is something called the microbiome. Now, we know this from humans and other animals. The studies go back way beyond what we've been able to do with horses until now, but we know that the gut flora, so that's all the bacteria that you have living in your gut that are normal bacteria, healthy bacteria, you need them to live. We know that they affect whether you are overweight or underweight. And that is no different in horses. We're starting to see that that same thing applies in horses as it does in humans and other species. So that's a fascinating thought if you think about how we use medicines, what we feed them, etc., etc. Wormers even, you know, there's all sorts of things that will affect their gut system, right? And then we've got the lifestyle issues. So in the UK, a lot of horses are kept in relatively sedentary lifestyles. So they're stabled for relatively long periods, or even just overnight stabling is, you know, basically putting a horse on bed rest, isn't it? And then they're kept in smaller paddocks. Potentially a lot of them are kept in individual paddocks nowadays. So they might just be eating rather than playing and frolicking and socializing and running around. We've got this incredible, wonderful feed shops full of beautifully packaged and designed feed, which I even used to go in and go and buy feed for my horse and get really excited about all the new things and what there was, and oh, shall I buy what's on offer? And it's no different to us going to the local supermarket and, you know, being tempted into things by all the wonderful packaging and the wonderful claims. And then we've got this lack of understanding and this lack of understanding how we can control things. And those are the two bits that I think we as a population, or a horse owning population, and as an industry can really try and work better on, because I think if we do have the right understanding, then we'll know what we need to do. We'll be much more inclined to make the right decisions, do the right things, and see some good results. So let's just quickly go through the genetics. So this is just a really interesting study done in Labradors. So we all know Labradors, they're probably the equivalent of the cobs in our horse world, who love to eat, keep their weight really easily, you know, very difficult to get them to lose weight. Well, a quarter of Labradors have been found to have a genetic mutation that causes them to have a 2 kilogram heavier body weight than the average Labrador. So that's quite an interesting thing, isn't it? If you thought about that as a horse, you know, that 2 kilograms in a, say, 20, 25 kilo dog, that's a significant proportion, isn't it? That's like 10%. So if you think about a horse that might be carrying around 10% more of its body weight because of genes that it can't help, that's in its genetics, that's in its DNA, that drives them to want to eat so much that that hunger is as strong as thirst. And we know that the desire to drink when you're thirsty, if you take water away from a human for, you know, a day, 2 days, you'll be so thirsty, you'll be desperate to drink. Well, that same drive is how strongly they feel the drive to eat. So when we see cobs and all these other horses and the ponies, and we laugh at how they're little gannets and they bang the door for their food and they can't wait to get their food, they really feel that. They are desperate to eat. They just want to eat. Now, does that mean we should give in and just feed them? Difficult, right? Really difficult to say. Like, imagine having this desire to eat something so much, but people were restricting your food. But if they don't restrict your food, you're going to get really overweight and you're going to get laminitis. So we're caught in this catch-22 already, and that's genetic problems. And we know in humans that there's a heritability for obesity. So that heritability is where you're inclined to inherit the propensity, or the kind of inclinity to be obese. That can be inherited through family lines. Okay, so we know that there are factors that we can't control, but we should perhaps be thinking about when we're breeding. Okay, when we're selecting horses to breed. So this is, you know, long-term goals potentially with the genetic side. And that would apply to these breeds that we talk about. So the cold-blooded ones, the natives. We know warm bloods actually also have a sort of increased risk of gaining weight. And some could argue we've been sort of indiscriminately breeding, which of course we have. We just breed whatever we like to breed. We don't think about lots of these more deeper characteristics. But equally, we've selectively bred some of these breeds to look like this. You know, if you think about some of our natives and the ones you see at the big shows, they have been bred to look like these round, shiny, peachy horses. And of course, it's been conditioned and brought up and fed and to look like this as well. But its genetics have been selected to be like that. So we've kind of been doing them an injustice, if you like, over the years already. And when we talk about this microbiome thing, I mean, it's just like the layers that are making this such a complex subject are just building up already. This microbiome thing is really fascinating. So they've proven with mice, and I won't go into the details, but they've taken the gut flora from human twins, where one is underweight or normal weight and one is overweight, and they've put them into identical mice. The mouse that received the gut microbes from the obese twin was more likely to gain weight, gain weight, I think it was twice as much or something more weight. So huge amount difference, okay, just from having not your own genes affected, but just by having the gut bacteria from something that's been overweight. So, you know, already we're thinking, crikey, this could have implications for irritable bowel syndrome, celiac disease, type 2 diabetes in humans. There is every chance this applies to horses. We know actually from human babies that if they're given antibiotics in the first 6 months of their life, that's probably changing the gut flora that they develop whilst they're babies. and they seem to have an increased risk of getting overweight later in childhood. So not just there and then, but later in life. So we've got to be really, really conscious of all the things we're doing that might be creating this sort of likelihood of becoming obese. And if you change something's microbiome, you can affect their weight. So there is definitely more things that we will probably emerge, if you like, in coming years that we'll understand about that. Now, I just popped this in for a nice little break from all the serious science, because this is a really interesting study, I think. So somebody studying these yellow-bellied marmots in Colorado Rocky Mountains discovered that their normal 8-month hibernation period, when of course they'd be losing a lot of the weight that they'd been building up, had been shortening because of climate change. So the first frost was getting later and the snow was melting earlier in the spring, and basically they weren't sleeping for as long. Now what was happening is they were waking up a month earlier from their hibernation and getting an extra month of eating and feeding and basically fattening themselves up even more, which meant they were gaining more weight during the summer months. So this sounds like, oh God, this is a disaster. But conversely, actually, in their case, they don't have hooves and won't get laminitis, I guess. And conversely, it helped them to improve survival and reproductive success. So, you know, we look at all these things and we think, oh, it's very simple, these things shouldn't happen. But it's not a clear benefit or not. Now, we know in horses that clearly if they're overweight and they get laminitis, that is not going to be a benefit to them. But it's just trying to demonstrate how complicated this subject is and how fascinating it is, actually. You can see why I've got lost in it. So looking at horse lifestyle, you know, we know that there are other species that struggle with issues that create an increased weight gain in them, basically. So sleep debt, lack of sleep will cause you to gain weight potentially. Light pollution will do the same. And we think that's because you know, particularly other animals, not so much humans, but these seasonal breeders have got receptors in their eyes and they pick up on light in varying degrees and certain hours of the day and things like that, sort of length of day. That will affect them quite a lot. And this appears to be true for lots of other species. So it's likely to be a thing that might consider with horses. Now, does leaving your horse's light stable on at night in winter for too long create some issues? We don't know, but it's entirely possible it does if you look at the other studies in other species. And then we know that out in the environment, there's lots of other hormone, so estrogen disrupting chemicals, and that applies to all the species. I mean, we are obviously polluting our world, as we well know, and there's every chance that those types of things are causing issues in the weight department as well. And when we look at the horse's lifestyle in the UK, well, as I've already mentioned, it's very far from what nature intended. You know, we keep them stabled in small paddocks. They're not covering miles like they were designed to do. The weather might be pretty inclement at times in this country, but it's not as bad as probably what they'd be exposed to up on the moors and on the hills where they were, you know, genetically designed to be. And we certainly don't probably help by sticking rugs on, lovely thick rugs and all these other things. We bring them in if the weather's too bad or a bit rainy. We try and save our paddocks. You know, I'm not being unsympathetic. I understand why we do these things. I've kept horses myself, but you can see how these things start to add up pretty significantly. And they're just like, as I say, a lot of them are kept in isolation. My horse was kept in, you know, individual paddocks on its livery yard. That's what they did. But I could tell he wasn't going and running around as much as he would have been when he was at the previous yard, when he was in a group of horses. So, you know, things like that really do impact over the days, the months, the weeks and the years. And so with this diet stuff, so supersizing processed meals, we know about this from humans, okay, portion sizes, all these things, high fat snacks, palatability, you know, sweetener things. We probably don't think of horse food as being particularly sweet, etc. But actually, we do know that in some of these horse feeds, they do put things in to make it more palatable. We've definitely created hay through selection, if you like, that horses are more likely to eat, more willing to eat. I think I was probably, you know, exactly the same. I had a thoroughbred and I used to think, oh, he's not eating that bale of hay, or he doesn't like it so much, I'll get rid of it and get one that he will eat. Maybe he just didn't need to eat as much of it. Maybe he shouldn't be a bad thing to be a bit more picky and not eat quite as much as he would the good bale. And then we know our pastures are basically a majority inherited cattle pastures. So they were designed, the grasses were sown and selected, if you like, for milk yielding cattle. And a lot of livery yards are now on those pastures. So the horses are actually grazing far too rich a pasture than they should be. We've obviously made life a lot easier for the horses as well. So good dental care and, you know, all this worm control that we've been doing. obviously, I'm not saying we don't do it, but it has meant that they are able to maintain their weight more easily than they have done in previous years or decades at least. And we've got to just be, like I said, a bit careful about, I'm not suggesting all the feed companies are manipulating us, but they're profit-making companies. They want to sell feed. You know, we ought to be careful we're not being unnecessarily coerced into feeding our horses something they shouldn't. So we shouldn't be looking at the bags and the selection that's on the shelves. We should be thinking about what our horse wants and seeking something that fits that. So a little bit about understanding. So the dangers of obesity and the appreciating that need to control it. It's a horrible thing to have to control what your horse is enjoying, but we have to for his own good. And I think if you switch off, or you decide that it's something you can't deal with, you don't want to deal with, and you bury your head in the sand, or you even consider that the evidence being presented to you is wrong, or they, you know, the vet telling you to diet your horse hasn't got the right idea at all. They've missed the point. They don't know you. They don't know your horse. That bit we need to change. Okay, I think it's really, if you've ever thought that yourself, or know someone that has done, it's really important to try and understand why they feel like that, and to try not to criticize, because I think you can lose people very easily, and I've certainly done that as a vet. You know, try to understand why they feel like that, and try and see if there's something in their repertoire of knowledge that's missing that might help them understand why this is so important. Because ultimately, the only person that is responsible for the horse's health is the person that's looking after it every day. And if they're seeking the right advice on the things they're doing, then things should go as well as they can do. They might not be perfect, but they'll go as well as they can do, and you're doing the best you can. So taking responsibility for that control and being accountable for it. You know, we do need to limit food, because ultimately that's one of the things we can control. We do have an obligation, if you're going to own a horse, to exercise it sufficiently. You know, we do need to try and improve how the horse is feeling full. So when I was saying about these horses that are desperate to eat, yeah, it's not okay to just starve them every day. No one wants to do that, and no one's intending that somebody should do that. But maybe we could think about changing what we feed, so we create more of a bulk of fibre and much less of the sugars and the concentrates. And when you think of forage, I think we underuse things like straw. You know, feeding straw is a fantastic way to get the horses to feel full and happy and chewing all the time without getting the calories that they get from hay. And then things like forage feeders, puzzle feeders, trickle nets. You know, there's tons of really good resources out there giving you ideas of how to make eating last longer and feel better for the horse without putting them at risk of all the sugars. But it's important not to try and, like I say, accuse people of failing their horses. I think people are trying to do their best. We just need to try and think of as many ways of doing that as we can. So when we talk about the control, of course, we know from the humans that we've got this genetic drive. It's kind of hardwired, and it's really important to recognize that the horses are not going to change. You're going to have a horse that is very hungry and slightly greedy potentially for its whole life. So it's important that you try and deal with it early on, and you maintain that way of managing them as best you can throughout that horse's life. And when I mentioned earlier about how some owners don't recognize that the horse might be overweight, I think that's really true. And I think we're all probably guilty of it. I had a spaniel that, as he got older, got fatter. I didn't want to see that. So I decided in my head he looked fine. So I know it happens, and I feel for those people. But I think that's where us as vets, and hopefully farriers, physios, saddle fitters, yard managers, you know, friends, can all pull together and try and, in a friendly and constructive way, help people manage their horses when they are overweight. And then just a bit really about the husbandry sort of styles. You know, I appreciate it's hard to change. If you are at a livery yard and there is very little ways you can alter how things are done at that yard, then it is difficult. It is absolutely very, very, very constraining to be, particularly on a property that's not yours, even if it is yours. You know, having the investment to do track systems and doing all these wonderful things, it takes money, you know, and then the land might not be suitable, or you might not have much land, so you've got to be careful you don't damage it with poaching and all these other things in the winter months. But I think we still have to do what we can, and we still have to try and find a solution that works. And I have had owners that have moved their horses to a livery yard that's further away or not as convenient for them, but because their horses needed that different environment, and they have seen the changes as a result, and it has benefited them. So I think it's important we consider those big changes, even if they might not be ideal for us as the humans. So how can your vet help? Well, this is just really to try and encourage you to speak to your vets. And I know not all vets are probably quite as keen on talking about obesity as I am, and I think that's fine, but we all have our areas of interest, and it's important to find somebody that feels the same as you do about trying to achieve a result. So try and find a vet, and it doesn't have to be the one you deal with on other things necessarily. It might be a vet or a nurse in the practice you use, that has a bit of expertise on the subject, has some ideas about intervention, or at least knows where to get the right solution ideas for you, and will work with you on those. So it's not just a case of sending you away with a whole booklet full of ideas. It's a case of going, actually, have you tried this, or this might work, and looking for a combination with you in your environment that you're in. And I think as well that kind of expertise is growing from a medical side in the veterinary population. I think we're all up to speed with the fact that, you know, there's lots more research now. There's loads of underlying diseases to check for, like Cushing's and EMS, and we can take the blood tests to do that and check for ACTH and check your horse's insulin. We can provide medications to help with these horses and manage them in the short and or potentially long term, which includes obviously controlling their Cushing's, for instance, or giving them these new drugs that you may have heard of called things like atuglaflozin, which can get rid of the insulin that's causing laminitis. But, you know, some of these things might be long-term or short-term, but they can't just be used in isolation. So that's why us as vets can't just fix your horse. And we need to work together. And that means everybody in your horse's team to try and get a solution and a strategy that will have some results. And that sort of extends from everything from assessing and managing and looking at the horse's diet to identifying which changes you can use. So yes, maybe you can't strip graze your fields, but could you try a grazing muzzle? Or he gets a grazing muzzle off all the time. Okay, well, shall we try a track system? Or, you know, can we move them to a different yard where there might be a different type of turnout, different type of grass even, you know, better grazing, if you like, for a horse that struggles with its weight. So it's about thinking outside the box sometimes, because I think once you're at the coalface and in it, sometimes you can't see all the options that somebody from the outside can. And I think really, I mean, this was my initial approach, and I'm just going to tell you guys to go and look this document up if you can. But there's a really good document online called When the Grass is Greener that a wonderful person called Tamsin Furtado has created with her team. And it does really break it down into how to address the tailored approach to these horses. And I think if there's only 5 things that you think of when you leave this webinar, then think about hard feed, think about forage, think about grazing, think about exercise, and think about how you can manage things like rugs and clipping. If you just do those 5 things, you'll probably find something or a combination of things that might help. And obviously you can delve deeper once you've mastered those sort of 5 basics. And then really it was just a bit of a slide to say that, you know, the common dietary approaches, sadly, are not going to be effective for all. And we know that. We've known that for years. We've studied horses in little herds of ponies up at the Animal Health Trust years ago, just up the road from where I am now, that they actually put these ponies on a negative calorie diet. So they were exercising them and feeding them less calories than they were burning. And they still, some of them gained weight. So we know that there are individuals that their owners are probably doing absolutely everything and they are not losing weight. And we don't want to accuse this owner of lying and sneakily feeding their horse when no one's looking, because that's often what used to happen. But we know that there will be weight loss resistant people and horses and dogs and everyone. So all species will have these kind of really stubborn weight resistant animals in them. So we need to think about that a little bit. And we also need to think a little bit more about how we monitor that weight, how we assess that weight, because we know body condition scoring, kilogram weights, even BMI in humans is only partially useful. Sometimes you have to be a little bit more wider about it. And we know for a fact that you need a personalized approach. So what works for your pony will not work for your other horse or your neighbor's horse or whatever. It will absolutely have to be done in a personalized way. So you know, unless you feel you can tackle that on your own, it is definitely going to need some outside help and some teamwork. So just to summarize, sorry, I've overrun a little bit, haven't I? Got excited. It's important to diagnose the cause. And when I say that, I mean it in a very generic way. So not only diagnose any underlying disease, but also to diagnose why this horse is overweight in its current genetics, current state, if you like medical state, its current management, diet, everything needs to be looked at. Because if you don't look at them all, you'll probably miss something really, really important. And then you can start to look at how you change little things all across that spectrum that will hopefully create something you can manage in a long-term way. You might need to do some short-term changes to particularly the ponies like got laminitis, of course, you can have to do something really, really urgently. But the key is to find something that will work long-term after that. And then you're going to need support. Like it's like anything. We know that humans that are struggling with weight loss, you need support, and you need to really ride that really rough and pretty convoluted road with people beside you, because it's not much fun, and we're not going to pretend it is. Thank you. That's all from me. And I'd just like to thank BEVA, obviously, who's invested huge amounts of time and energy and all sorts and people in this subject, which is also it extends to all the charities. I mean, they've done tons, and I believe lots of money has gone into this subject, trying to research it and trying to work out ways, and things that have been tried and failed. But I think we're getting there. I think we just need everyone to try and get on the same page.
Thank you so much. That is absolutely fascinating. I've been gripped the whole way through. Because you've also explained obesity in a broader context, and it's just really, really interesting to understand that it's not just necessarily how much goes in, but all of the other all the other factors that are in play as well. So absolutely fascinating. Love that.
Yeah. And I think I'm that weight loss stubborn person. I seem to do a lot of exercise and reduce what I eat, and hey, never mind.
This is it. Like I think we can all liken to that. Like we all know what it's like trying to manage your own weight. So why is it any different for horses? Well, why should it be any easier for horses? That's what I'm saying. So I think the key is to make it clear that we're not expecting anyone to turn these horses around overnight. You know, this is a big old goal. And actually, for some people, it might be too much for them. And I wonder if we need to select our horses when we buy them a bit more carefully, you know, like don't go for the really big, heavy, slow, safe cob, potentially, because he might be a nightmare to manage, you know, like, so that's kind of got to be flipped on its head a little bit as well, I think.
No, very good point. Very good point. Guys, whilst you're on, if you would like to type some questions, then please do so, and we'll crack on with asking some of those to Lucy now. I think we had one by email, didn't we, to start with?
We did, yeah. Ali sent one in before the webinar. So Ali says, and I think a lot of people will empathise with this, I have a stocky fell pony. His ribs are easily felt and often seen. He has some fat on his shoulders and tail head, but stores most fat on his crest. How can I make judgments about how much fat is there and how much fat is too much? Thanks from Alison.
Yeah, that's a really good point, a really good question. And I think something that I bet a lot of people can liken to. So that's why those body condition scoring charts can be a little bit unhelpful, I think, because they just blow the horse up very proportionately. And so it's very easy to go, well, he doesn't have that bum, or he doesn't have that crest, so therefore he must be on a lower body condition score. But exactly as she's identified, he's carrying too much weight in one area, and that is still relevant and significant. So yes, you don't want him to lose that any more weight over his ribs potentially, but is having crest fat sitting there okay for him? Possibly not, because we actually know crest fat is there's some evidence to suggest that crest fat is the more dangerous fat, actually, which is interesting, isn't it? We can't prove it in every case, but there's a trend there. What I would say is that the best thing she can do is probably, if she feels she's got him in the best middle ground she can, so ribs, but too cresty, any more weight loss would end up with a sort of maybe slightly too thin horse, then I would ask my vet, to take blood tests and check the insulin of that horse. And it might require a couple of tests on different days, because insulin, as we know in humans, changes through the day. But doing an insulin test an hour after he's had his breakfast, let's say, will give you a good idea whether he's in an insulin dysregulation zone. So if he's in a slightly dangerous way with his insulin and his reaction to his food, because that would mean he needs to lose more weight. If his insulin is actually quite stable, I would leave him as he is. So that's where the weight loss thing you don't have to get all your horses down to like body condition score 2. And if they've got a tiny bit of fat on them, you must keep dieting and dieting and dieting them. There will be some that will cope with a little bit of fat pad here and there. I think what we shouldn't do is assume that it's okay. I think we should check if it's okay. And doing that insulin blood test, and you might need to check it every year. I'm not suggesting one test rules out insulin problems, but it gives you a little bit of reassurance that he's not about to go into that horrible insulin and laminitis zone.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you, really helpful. I've got a question from me based on a horse that I had on loan a couple of years ago. So when she arrived, she was really overweight. She was an Irish draft, very, very overweight, and she just seemed to survive on fresh air. So I can understand that a little bit more now. And the thing, I had her on a very bare paddock, and she had the tiniest little bit of hay. But the thing that was worrying me was she lost a teeny bit of weight. I mean, really just a tiny bit of weight. But the thing that was worrying me was her diet was so restricted. I was worried she was going to get ulcers because she just didn't have there was no way of giving her a constant flow of forage, if that makes sense. So how do you balance that? What's been going on there? Yeah.
That's exactly the other big question that people often ask is, we know that horses will get ulcers if they're starved for too long a periods, and particularly if it's repetitively, you know, like every day they're going for hours and hours without feed. So we don't want horses to be without forage. And you are absolutely right to identify that they need to be eating. You know, they can go for like 4, maybe 5 or 6 hours overnight, particularly without forage, because their stomachs don't produce as much acid. So you're less likely overnight to have a problem. But there are horses where they're being dieted so severely that they're probably not getting enough forage. You've got to be really careful about that. What I would say is that on the whole, those horses can be the straw fed ones. So if you bulk out with a bit of straw, what hay you're giving, and it has to be nice straw. And I know that's not easy to come by nowadays. You know, straw's got many other uses now, biofuel and all sorts of things. It's got a bit more value to it. So it's not easy to come by straw like it used to be. But if you can get a source of straw which is reasonable quality, and the key there is dust, actually, isn't it? Let's face it, dusty straw needs to be avoided, or moldy anyway. And I'd get the straw, I'd wash it. So I'd put it in a hay net or in a bucket, and I'd wash it, dunk it like you would with straw, hay, sorry. And then I'd mix it in with the hay in the net. And you can do a ratio of, like, say, 70% hay to 30% straw. And if you mix that, then you're just bulking it out a bit more. And the straw is obviously a lot tougher, so it will increase the chewing time as well. And then if you're double netting that, or putting it in a trickle net, or putting it in multiple trickle nets, so it's in different places, let's say in the stable, they've got to work for it a bit more. That tended to solve that issue for most horses. Like I say, there are always going to be those really unusual cases where even doing that, sometimes they don't lose any weight. So I don't want people to think that, you know, there are not horses that are going to be totally impossible to manage. But I would be trying that in that case. I would be, if I've sort of done everything else I can, you know, restricted grazing, trying a muzzle. I know they look awful and everyone hates seeing muzzles, but they are lifesavers. I've seen them save lives. Then I'll be moving to that idea of trying to maybe feed some straw, or even trying the straw earlier on. Even it's not, you know, it's not a bad thing to try, but that can really help get that bit of forage in and keep them chewing. Because agreed, you don't want to be seeing a horse stood unable to eat anything for hours at a time. That's not welfare friendly either. So
brilliant.
And on the straw front, if you are lucky enough to have a choice of straw, is there any particular difference or benefit between wheat, oat or barley at all?
There's been quite a bit of chat about this, and I've got to say I found a lot of conflicting evidence. I think basically the better the quality of the straw is probably more important. Does that make sense? So I wouldn't rule out any of the straws. I think what I'd be more swung by is, does it look really clean? Can I wash it up nice and easily? Like, there's not lots of dirty water coming off it. You know what I mean? When you open those, and you do get some that are like almost computer generated golden straw, and there's no dust on them, and like that's the straw I'd be choosing over anything else. So but yeah, I don't think there's a huge amount of evidence supporting choosing types of straw. I think it's probably better to judge it on the quality if you can. And don't forget, they won't eat it straight away. That's the other thing. So people try straw and go, won't eat it, no, hopeless. You will eventually. I know you won't want it to start with. It'd be like someone giving me dry Rivetas. Of course but you know, it sounds a bit mean, but you've got to persist and they'll get used to it. It's just like changing anything, isn't it? They're not going to suddenly rush into it unless it's, you know, polos, obviously. So just bear in mind, it's not palatable, but just keep mixing it in every day. And, you know, a lot of them do take to it eventually, if not quite quickly. So don't be put off.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. Really helpful.
And again, you know, as you think of a question, guys, pop it in there, and I'm actually going to just put into the chat, that's the link to you can download the PDF that you mentioned from Terms Invitado.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
If anyone wants to copy that out of chat and paste it separately, you can do. So a question now about younger horses. So I'll give you an example. I've got it's a rescue gypsy cob, lightweight, you know, a very small cob who is approximately 4, we think, roughly. So I'm doing in-hand work with him, but he's not got any muscle tone from any work at the moment. So he's got a little bit of a, you know, lower slung belly and a little bit of fat. How do you feel with a young horse if they've got no muscle tone? How do you assess fat versus just lack of muscle tone, would you say? Yeah,
I think it's not easy. So I'm going to say that straight away. I think there are ways of doing it. What I would say is you don't want a youngster to be overweight at all. So I would always err on the side of caution, even more with the youngsters. But you probably need to get either your vet or your physio to come and help you. They're both going to be quite good at distinguishing the muscle from the fat. And obviously fat sits in fairly classical places like the crest, like the shoulder, you know, that kind of rib fat, the rump and the tail head. So you can identify it when it's quite obvious, but I think you're right, in youngsters which haven't undergone any kind of real body development yet, it can be a bit harder. So I'd probably get someone to help you and to feel it. So a muscle will tense, obviously. So when it's in use, it will go hard, it will tense up. You can, to some extent, sounds awful, don't get kicked, but you could put your pen into certain areas, and you can sometimes, like your fingernails of your pen, and it, you know, you'll see physios doing that when they're doing all the reflexes. So, you know, you're not being mean, but you're just seeing if there's any response within the tone of it, and that should tell you if there's muscle or fat. And the fat will often sit in a layer over the top, so you have to kind of gauge it slightly, don't you? But obviously a muscle should go rock hard, whereas a fat pad won't, obviously. But don't forget, fat when it gets really big goes really hard, doesn't it? Like a crest fat, when it reaches an extreme stage, I suppose, you know, that's rock solid, but then it's not like a muscle, is it? It's not relaxing, if you like. It's not, so you should be able to tell, but it's not easy. So I think just get someone to show you if you can.
I know a lot of people are in schemes now with vets, and certainly our vets come out around about 3 times a year anyway, because they're doing vaccinations, they do our teeth, and they do an annual health check as part of it. So there's at least three pieces of advice that most people, hopefully, if they're in one of those schemes, can get, which saves money.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Heidi, did you have another?
Yeah, I did. A question about type of feed. So the feed companies always tell us that we need a balancer with our horse's diet. I know that the calories aren't huge in the balancers, but do they really need the balancer? How does that work with the rest of the diet? And
yeah, so this is a good question. This comes up a lot on the groups that I will sort of monitor on social media. So there's a lot of argument. So the key thing is that if a horse is being dieted, you've got no idea whether it's getting the right vitamins, minerals, and essential amino acids and proteins. So those things are what's needed for the horse's body, system, cells, everything to be healthy. So on a horse that's on a full ration and being fed normally, probably not a big deal. But when a horse that's being restricted at any point or in any way, always try and feed a pelleted balancer, because if you look on the back of and it's really hard to grasp this, once you do, it'll become really obvious. If you look at the back of the bag, obviously it will have like calories, and it will have all the sort of nutritional analysis on there, but you're feeding a cup of that, so it's a concentrate. So actually the calories in a cup are negligible. There's very few calories in there. Obviously if you were feeding 2 scoops of it or a bucket of it, that would be a really high calorific diet, but it's not very much per cup, so you don't have to worry about calories, particularly in the light versions. You know, they all have like a light balancer version that'll be sort of on the minimum that's achievable, and all you're getting in those pelleted balancers are vitamins, minerals, proteins, amino acids. If you choose to try and use one of the powdered balancers, and I'm not suggesting they're all pointless, because some of them have got good stuff in them, but they're often missing some of the amino acids, or they're missing some of the protein, because protein and some of the amino acids can be very unstable in the compounds they use. Okay. So some of the powders they just degrade. So they might be in there to start with. I'm not suggesting they're not. I'm not saying anyone's lying about what's in there, but they're often very unstable and they don't keep, basically. Whereas the pelleted balancers, on the whole, from all I know, particularly all the mainstream manufacturers at least, have been proven to not degrade in the time that you're likely to have a bag open. So you're confident then for that throughout that bag, that horse is getting what it says on the tin. So yeah, that would be my advice. And it doesn't matter which brand you use. I'm not tied to any brand at all. So, but you know, go for the mainstream ones. Obviously, I think you're going to be more safe with those, but I would avoid the powder ones, because I just think if you're feeding a balancer, normally it's because you need to get all those other things in there. And if you're not sure they're all in there, for me, that's the false economy.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And that reassures me, because my cob cross, that's the only thing she has is forage and then a cup of balancer. That's all she needs.
That's what she needs. Yeah, no, it really is. It seems mad, doesn't it? But I suppose it's like us taking a vitamin tablet or something.
Yes.
And we've got a question from Karen. We have an Irish sports horse currently coming in daily with grass glands. Is there a link with spring grass sugar levels in grass, or is it likely to be an allergic reaction? What should we be doing to reduce or eliminate? Or if an allergic reaction, can horses get grass glands from hay?
Yeah, this is one of those funny questions, isn't it? So grass glands, believe it or not, as common as they are, has very little research. We don't really know much about them. What we do know, and I think it's important to know that we're talking about the same thing here. If you've got those grass glands that are there, you know, almost in the throat latch area there, and they're kind of long and sort of a bit like sort of lamb chop sideburns that you see a man wearing, those are the salivary glands. And what we think is happening is that some horses, as they're eating, are having a little reaction, allergic reaction of sorts, but obviously nothing sinister, to something that they're eating. And that could be something pollinating, or it could be a protein that happens to be in the plant at that point, or some other, you know, allergen that we probably never ever be able to find, because it would be a million things that would come up as potentials. But something, and they'll often follow a pattern with the seasons, or a certain paddock, or randomly they'll just appear in one horse that's been in that field every year of its life, and it will just come and it will go, and we won't always know. And I think that's the problem, is yes, it probably is some sort of allergic reaction to something. Ultimately, if it's not bothering them, I think I wouldn't worry. And if it's transient and it goes away, I definitely wouldn't be worrying. If it persists or the horse is in pain, that would be more of a concern for me. And particularly if that horse is new, or that it's new to the field, then I'd be a little bit more cautious. I wouldn't be panicking, but I'd be a little bit more cautious and be wondering whether it's allergic to something that's going to be in that field long term, or going to keep coming back every season. But I would say on the whole, that's quite rare. I've never, in fact, I can't even think of a case where a horse has had to move entirely. I think they've had to move them out of the paddock for a period of time. And it might even be that, you know, a bit of wind and some rain washes away whatever's come out of whatever plant it is that's created the issue. And certainly with hay, as mentioned, you know, hay batches will potentially contain anything from that field at that point at which it was cut. So, you know, I don't think you'll ever find the cause out and identify it. But I think being kind of logical to your approach about how to manage that is the best thing you can do. And normally bringing the horse in and putting its hay in the hay net for the night, and it's having its head up and gravity doing its thing and taking the edema and the drainage, you know, down, normally reassures you that it's okay. But don't forget, they've also got lymph nodes under here. So that's why I say when we're talking about salivary glands and grass lumps, it's normally this bit here. Whereas if we're talking about lymph nodes under here, that's a different thing. And that would be more of a immune reaction in its immune system, as opposed to just a local reaction in the salivary glands. So that would be more of a concern under here. And obviously we all know about strangles and all other sort of scary things. But I think when she's saying grass lumps, I'm assuming we're all talking about that sort of hamster appearance.
Yeah. Okay. Just great.
I think we're through questions. Yeah. I think you must have answered everything on the journey, which has been awesome. Thank you, Lucy.
I hope you enjoyed this slightly alternative track. There was a different approach to it all, but
I thought it was fantastic. It's fascinating to hear the comparisons between species and so on.
There's so much we can learn. I think that's the point. I think, you know, if we just look at our little narrow field and think about horses all the time, we kind of miss so much that we can learn from all the other research, you know. And so I think that for me was what enlightened me to a lot of what we know, and made me sit up and think a bit harder about how we manage it, because we've been hitting our heads against brick walls for quite a few years, I think, with obesity in horses. So we've got to think about a different approach, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I will just mention as well, I don't know if any of you are signed up, anyone who's watching or watches it, you can probably find it on the Spillers website. I had an email with it in where they've got a really good, and it's photographs of real horses from the side and the bum to see if they're peachy or not. Lots of different breeds, and they've got a quiz for you, and they're using the 1 to 9 scale, and you can go through and you assess what you think, and as you get to the end, it tells you what they think from a qualified nutritionist point of view, as to how they're scoring. They might just get your eye in if you're looking to condition score your own horse, so worth a look for that as well.
Yeah, good one, good knowledge.
Yeah,
I'll just share next week.
yeah. So yeah. Oh, sorry. You go ahead.
No, I was waiting for you.
Oh, okay. Well, you're going to go ahead. So yes, next week we've got Leslie from Balance International, and they are an organisation. They're celebrating their 30th year this year, actually, at the moment, and they are an organisation that's taken they call it a holistic approach. So a holistic approach to functional saddle fitting for horses, really looking at how a saddle can fit in a way that it allows the horse's muscles to move more naturally, to lift and engage under the saddle. And they're really passionate as well about horse welfare and how they can use saddle technology in a way and increase our understanding in a way that we have a happier and more comfortable horse. So it's going to be really interesting to hear Leslie's point of view. And she's she's a horse trainer herself, so she's got her own horses as well, so she can give you that broad perspective. And we also just wanted to remind everybody that there are 60 more, now 61 very shortly, webinars to watch on demand on the website, ranging from loading issues with Susie, school horsemanship. There's Jason Webb, who's talking about different behaviour issues, how to deal with spooking. There's one about getting your horse fit. And most recently, you might have listened to the Steph Croxford webinar. And there's one with Mary King, etc., etc., etc. So lots to watch there. So do check those out when you've got a little bit of time. So that just remains for us to say a huge thank you to Lucy. That was really fabulous. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. Loved it. That was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you for having me.
No worries. And guys, if you can fill in the questionnaire when we go offline, that would be awesome. And yeah, see people next week. Thanks very much, Lucy.
Right. See ya. Bye-bye.
Bye.